Hello and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're doing well. In this video, as you can see from the very full desk right now, I'm going to be reviewing the Royal Talens Art Creation Sketchbook. I am going to be basing the review on my experience of filling several of them now, and I've picked out 4 of the ones I've filled to use as examples during the review. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of the sketchbooks and the paper, and also talk about how the paper handles different mediums, including paint and dry media, ink. We're going to go over quite a few different mediums. So in the description, I'm going to leave timestamps for the different mediums I talk about, and also about any topics that come up as well regarding the sketchbook. If you have any questions about the sketchbook, the paper, or a medium that I do not cover, feel free to leave it in the comments below and I'll get back to you. And first, we're going to start with the general stats of the sketchbook. I've left the info card on this one here. This is a new one I picked up recently, but I've taken off the plastic sheet. These ones still have the plastic covering them. And I've taken off the plastic on this one just so that you're not having to deal with the glare while I show you it. So this is the small version, which is roughly A6 in size. It's 9 by 14. All of the sketchbooks, no matter what size you get, have 80 sheets in them, which corresponds to 160 pages. It's 140 GSM, which is £90. It is acid-free, which means it's archival in that respect. And the paper is fine grain and it is cream in colour, which I'll go over the paper in more detail in a moment. The sketchbooks are all hardbound. They all have an elastic band and they all come with a colour corresponding ribbon based on the colour of the cover. Next, I'm going to go over the cream colour of the paper and also the fine grain texture and talk about the pros and cons of this. So first, I'm going to show you just how cream this paper really is. I've got a piece of just your standard printing paper here, and if I put it against the page, you can see how warm the art creation paper is. This is one of the darkest creams out of all of the cream paper that I've used. I'd say it's closest in comparison to the warm papers offered by Stillman & Byrne in the Gamma and I believe it is the Delta sketchbooks. And depending on the kind of moleskin sketchbook you get, because the moleskin sketchbooks can vary quite wildly sometimes in how dark of a cream the paper is. Sometimes this is lighter and sometimes it's darker. I do have one moleskin sketchbook with me that I can show you. As you can see, the moleskin is still definitely cream, but it is slightly lighter than the art creation. So that's something to consider if you have a preference for white or cream paper. If you are new to sketchbooks or you're not sure the difference between cream and white paper and you don't necessarily know the pros and cons of it, I'm going to go over a few for you. So the cream, the warmth of the paper can affect how colours appear. So if you use transparent mediums like watercolour or alcohol markers, the warmth of the paper can show through underneath transparent mediums and slightly affect how they appear on the paper. Some people love this, some people hate this. So it's something to consider and whether it would bother you or not. Another thing to consider is the scans that you might make of your drawings and your photos as well will have a darker background as a result of the cream of the paper. This may bother you and it might not bother you, especially if you like to make products from scanning your sketches, say like prints, for example. There are some artists I follow on Instagram, and I will be mentioning some artists later in this video who use these sketchbooks, that make finished pieces in art creation sketchbooks, and they happily make prints and stickers using the scans on this paper. So it is, again, just down to whether it bothers you or not. Another thing that is a positive, actually, of using cream paper is to do with eye strain. I have found that I tend to gravitate more towards my art creation sketchbooks for longer studying periods and when I'm sketching outside, especially rough sketching outside. Because when you are drawing in a really bright location, like outside in the sun, the light from the sun will hit your paper and then go back into your eyes. And if you're using blinding white paper, it will be blinding to your eyes. And if you're drawing for a really long time inside, the light, even from your room, will bounce into your eyes from the white of the paper. And I have noticed that I go for much longer periods in my study sessions when I'm using art creation without any eye strain at all, compared to drawing on my graphics tablet or drawing in white sketchbooks. So that's something else to consider as well. And that mainly covers the cream coloured paper. The other thing I want to cover in this section is the texture of the paper. Now, the texture will show through more in my medium examples, but I'm going to go over a little bit now the texture. So this is fine grain, which means that it's pretty smooth. Whether you like smooth, rough, or medium paper is again down to your personal preference. I'm going to be saying this a lot, I'm sorry, but I love smooth paper most of the time for most of the mediums I like to use. The only time that I would say that that isn't the case is if I'm using cold pressed paper for watercolour. But for sketchbooks, I love smooth paper, so this fits really, really nicely within that area for me. It is smooth enough to use ink. So these were done plein air outside, and these were done with a uni-pin fine liner, which is very similar to a micron. But the paper is also, it's got enough grain to it. I don't know if you can hear. It's got enough grain to it for pencil and colour pencil as well. And you'll be able to see that a little bit better in my medium examples. But that kind of just covers the basics a little bit about the smooth paper. So now I'm going to get on to the media examples so that you can see this paper in action a little bit better. First, for the medium section, we're going to cover graphite. So this sketch here was done in Blackwing Pearl pencil, which is this one here. It is what the company refers to as the balanced lead. And if I were to put it on the B scale, then I'd place it around 3B or 4B. A Japanese company 3, probably. The Japanese leads of pencils tend to be softer than European and American brands. And you can see the texture of the paper a lot easier in this example. It's definitely a fine grain, but you can see the tooth to the paper still. It's not perfectly smooth. You also get a nice dark value with it. I didn't get the full range of darkness from a Blackwing in this, as in I didn't try to get darker. I can go darker than this on the paper with a Blackwing. And I've got some other examples. These here are, that's a study I just did from imagination. These are a study I did from imagination, a head I did from imagination. These are studies. These are studies from the Joe Weatherly Guide to Drawing Cats, because I've started learning to draw domestic cats in further detail. So these were all done with HB mechanical pencil. And I have another example here. And this sketchbook is from early 2022, when I was starting to learn how to draw big cats. So we have a tiger sketch here, and this was done also in the same black wing pearl pencil. And something that I want to bring up is that very soft lead can transfer onto the other side of the paper. With this sketchbook, you can see some of it is transferred here from this drawing. So I recommend, if you use soft lead like black wings or 6B, to use fixative on your drawings if you use the sketchbook. Personally, I found most sketchbooks with softer lead will transfer onto the other side of the spread. This one I used fixative for. I don't always remember to use fixative, so some of my sketches do transfer. It's something to note, and if that bothers you, it's something to consider whether or not this sketchbook is right for you. With colour pencil, I have a few different styles of drawing to show you. First, I'm going to show you some line drawings, some line sketching in colour pencil. I have sketch with me videos of both of these spreads on YouTube if you want to see them in action a little bit more. This is the primary way that I draw in colour pencil in art creation sketchbooks, but I do also layer a little bit, but I'm still slowly getting into drawing in that style. But I do have an example to show you. So that gives you an idea. These are tricolour pencils, so they have 3 colours in the lead. And this is a beginner example of some of the layering you can do. This is using not polychromos, it's the Faber-Castell Albrecht Dürer, the watercolour, the water-based colour pencils. If you want to see an artist that actually specialises in layering colour pencils, especially for portraiture, check out Doodle Traffic on Instagram. She primarily uses colour pencil and also pencil a bit in art creation sketchbooks, and even makes products. She makes stickers and prints of her drawings in these sketchbooks. So it's a really, really good way of seeing, if you're into colour pencil, the extent that you can layer on this paper by checking her out. And that covers colour pencil based on how I use colour pencil in these sketchbooks. Next is ink and the various different kinds of ink pens. With ink, I have noticed that different kinds of ink and different kinds of pens have varying differences in how well they work on this paper. I love using, for waterproof black ink, fineliners and brush pens by brands like Micron, Unipin, Faber-Castell Pitt. Those kinds of pens work really, really well on this paper. However, some other kinds of ink I found bleed through to the other side. So an example of that is the Pentel Fude brush pen. This will bleed through to the other side of the page, and it also doesn't come out as black and as pigmented, anywhere near as black and pigmented as it does on other kinds of paper, like say the Stillman & Byrne Epsilon or the Hahnemuhle Nostalgie paper. Another pen as well that has a similar problem as this is the Pentel Pocket Brush Pen, which I don't have on me right now. It's hiding somewhere. That also fades quite a bit. So I've got a few examples here. This along the top is the pen that I just showed you, the Fude brush pen. And that comes out almost looking grey. And then here, as I've said, with a little smiley face, works well on this paper as expected because I've used it for quite a while. And these here are the Pentel Pocket Brush Pen. It comes out darker than this one, but it's still not quite as black and pigmented as it can be on other kinds of paper. And if you do really, really thick washes, heavy washes with the ink, it can slightly seep through to the other side. Not as heavily as it does with this, and I will show you in a moment the other side of the sheet. And it does produce pretty effects, the Fude brush pen. when you use water with it, because this isn't waterproof like the pocket brush pen is. But overall, I prefer using this pen on other kinds of paper just because of how it comes out overall. So you'll see some morning warm-ups here, and you can see the brush pen seeping through from the other side. Another kind of pen that I really like using on this paper is ballpoint pen. And I use ballpoint pen for studying, and I also use it for just relaxed sketching as well. So I've got an example of how I use it for studying here. This is again studies using the Joe Weatherly Guide to Drawing Cats that I've been doing recently in my study sessions. But then I will also use ballpoint pen for my just like relaxed studying for my, not studying, relaxed sketching for myself, sketching from imagination and just sketching for myself. I sketched this entirely in ballpoint pen. I didn't do any pencil underdrawing. It was just ballpoint pen, and it's black ballpoint pen and red ballpoint pen. And I sketched this really lovely and slowly while listening to their new album on repeat. If you know, you know. And that's kind of covering the basics of most black ink pens and also ballpoints. Next, I'm going to go over markers, and I'm going to cover acrylic marker, alcohol marker, and water-based markers. I don't have many examples of acrylic marker on this kind of paper, but if you want to check out an artist who uses art creation sketchbooks primarily for acrylic marker art, I recommend checking out Eyes Our Eyes on Instagram. I'll leave their name on screen and also in the description as well. But in my experience, they work well enough on this paper. I probably wouldn't do a lot of layering, but it works smoothly enough on the paper, especially if you use a light hand. If you're quite heavy-handed, you're probably going to more likely cause pilling on the paper, but otherwise it works well enough, I'd say. With alcohol markers, I don't have as many drawings to show you as some of my other sketchbooks where I'd use acrylic markers, not acrylic, alcohol markers, but I will show you a couple things. So this is just a little swatch sheet, so you can also see how the warmth of the paper might affect the colours. And then also here I have just a little guy, a little frog. So in my opinion, I enjoy using alcohol markers on this paper. It does bleed through to the other side of the sheet. I haven't seen it bleed through onto the following sheet, but I do tend to put a piece of scrap paper behind the sheet I'm working on anyway, just in case. So overall, for sketching purposes, I find this paper works perfectly fine for alcohol markers, but I would probably recommend putting a sheet behind it just in case anyway. And again, as mentioned in the cream colour section, it could slightly affect how the colour of your markers, because it's a transparent medium, can appear in comparison to white paper. If that's a problem for you, it's something to consider. Water-based markers work okay on this sketchbook paper based on my preferences. Depending on the brand of the water-based marker, there'll be slight texture differences. You can see that there's slight texture to larger washes. This is Tombow ABT marker, and this here is Faber-Castell water-based markers. It's the long grey kind, which has a brush on one end and a fine liner on the other, just like the Tombow. And then here, for this study spread, this is Acrylic brush pens in two different kinds of grey on top of ballpoint pen. Eckerline markers I've found to be the juiciest water-based markers, and that does end up coming out on this paper a little bit more. They can spread a tiny bit more sometimes if you're getting a particularly juicy stroke out of them. It can also buckle the paper slightly as well when you're using Eckerline markers, or if you're doing a very, very large area. If you want to see a creator who uses water-based markers in conjunction with a ballpoint pen for sketching, check out Dibugante Noctano, I believe that's how you pronounce it, on Instagram. And he uses water-based markers, sometimes Eckerlines, sometimes Pitt brush pens, various different kinds of water-based markers, and then uses ballpoint pen on top or underneath them. So you have another view of how they can be used on art creation sketchbooks by checking him out as well. I mainly use water-based markers for undersketches and also gestural studies. I really like using the fineliner end and sometimes the brush pen end of dual brush pens to do gesture studies, especially when I'm drawing moving animals or moving people. It's a fun way of doing it without being intimidated by a black permanent line in comparison to, say, like a light grey line or a light purple line. I don't often use water-based markers to colour a whole sketch or for adding a really, really large background to a sketch. Mainly because I don't like how streaky water-based markers can be on most kinds of paper if you go back over areas, which on this paper it can be a little bit streaky if you go back over areas in most water-based markers. That's something to keep in mind as well. Watercolour actually works surprisingly well on this paper as long as you're just doing light washes and you are very, very aware that it does not work like watercolour paper. If you want to do heavy washes or you want to do like lots of layering, wet into wet, this isn't really the paper for you. Do not expect it to act like watercolour paper, but you can definitely use it to tone sketches, to add washes over ink sketches or pencil sketches. And the colours do look surprisingly nice on this paper for light washes. It does buckle the pages, but they do end up very flat afterwards. There's very minimal bumps still. And here's the other side where I did some more. So I've got burnt sienna and ultramarine here, and then just mixing different greys and browns. So overall, I enjoy this paper for very, very light, low pressure sketching, light washes in watercolour. I do also use the paper for, let me see if I have some examples. Here we are. So I showed this earlier in the pencil section. There's actually a watercolour sketch underneath this, and I'll show one down here that I didn't end up doing a pencil sketch over. So I did an underdrawing essentially in watercolour paint using just a brush and light grey watercolour by mixing ultramarine and burnt sienna together. And I really enjoy this as a sketching method on this paper. It works perfectly well for me. I like the results of undersketches like this. It's nice for gesture studies. It's nice for underdrawings to then do ink drawings or graphite drawings on top of. It's just a fun little sketching tool for me. So that's another thing that you can definitely do perfectly fine on this paper with watercolour. In comparison to watercolour, when it comes to gouache, and this is traditional gouache, I really like doing studies in gouache on this paper, way more so than how watercolour acts on this paper even. It's been a really, really enjoyable experience, again, just as a sketching method for watercolour, not watercolour, for gouache. So this is done in gouache as well down here. It was a little thumbnail I did first to get the general idea of what was going on with the study. And then this was done in traditional designer's gouache. And I also did some other examples as well. So this is another one that I did, just playing around with still life studies, but in like a simplified graphic way. And another one as well there. So all of those were done in traditional designer's gouache. I don't have any examples of acrylic gouache and also acrylic paint. However, I recommend checking out the artist Emily Hughes on YouTube and Instagram. She uses acrylic gouache and normal gouache, and also sometimes acrylic paint in her sketchbooks. She uses both art creation sketchbooks and Moleskine as well, so you can get a bit of a comparison there. She also uses oil paint in some of her sketchbooks as well. I haven't used oil paint in these sketchbooks either. When you're using oil paint in sketchbooks, which is possible, you do have to prepare the paper first. It doesn't matter what sketchbook you're using. You need to seal and protect the paper on both sides, because otherwise it is just going to disintegrate because of the oils over time. So you can find videos out there that will also show you how to prepare your paper, and I believe Emily Hughes did a video on that as well in the past. So it's worth checking her out as well to see how acrylic paint and oil and gouache act on this paper, and also in comparison to other sketchbooks as well. I hope this video was helpful in showing you how this paper looks with different mediums and giving you an overview of the paper and how I like using the sketchbook as well. Overall, to give my opinions and overall review of the sketchbook, this is my preferred studying sketchbook. This is the sketchbook I go to most of the time for just pencil, ballpoint sketching, studying, and also for really, really relaxed dry media sketching as well. It works well enough for me to use light washes of wet mediums, but this is not my preferred sketchbook to go to do watercolour art inside. So I would prefer going to Stillman & Burn Alpha or Beta, or even Etcher if I was going for really heavy watercolour, and even Strathmore mixed media, which I've recently started working in as well. I'd prefer going more the mixed media and cotton paper routes if you are a heavy watercolour sketcher. But overall, especially for dry media, I love the art creation sketchbooks. Are they perfect? No. Are they for everyone? No. And I hope that being quite thorough with each medium in this video has helped you gain a sense for whether the sketchbook is the right thing for you or not, because it is very tempting sometimes to see an artist online, on Instagram, YouTube, whatever, when they're using a particular sketchbook and they say that they love it, for you to go out and buy it, only for you to figure out that it is not the right thing for you. So I'm hoping that by being both factual and showing you things and also giving my subjective opinion as well helps you decide if this is something that would be right for you or not. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any further questions about this sketchbook, please leave it in the comments below. Thank you for everyone who's been liking and subscribing and chatting with me in the comments. It's lovely to hear from you all, and I'll see you in next week's video. Bye!